Okay, so really, my first question is, what really prompted you guys to write Soy Not Oi?
So basically what prompted it was that we were experimenting with vegetarianism and veganism and whatnot, and there really wasn't a lot of resources at the time. This was a time when, grocery stores didn't have veggie burgers. I mean, you really had to get that kind of thing at a health food store. So, and it was, even, I think at the time, even more ridiculously expensive than it is now, proportionally anyway. And because we were sort of in the kind of DIY spirit, if something's not there, then make it, and that I think was a big part of our lives in general. We were, I was involved in bands, and Joel and I were also involved in setting up shows, and, so there was this definite kind of, and living in an area where I think we were, generally speaking, not super excited about the area, but there was always this kind of spirit like, well, if there aren't cheap shows to go to, we should do that, and so I think it was kind of in that vein, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
And we had, I know for myself, and I'm not sure if this would be true for Joel or not, but I imagine he would say the same thing. We were both involved in lots of political kinds of things, and we're going to a lot of rallies and activism, and people would say, "Oh, so you're vegetarian?" Like just kind of assuming, and after saying no too many times, it was just like kind of like, why aren't we vegetarian? In terms of like thinking about the kind of lifestyle we wanted to lead, and what kinds of things were important to us, and just kind of kept running into people who had thought about food and foodways and the environment and that kind of stuff as it linked to other kinds of issues that we were interested in, and so that kind of got us on the, I think, thinking about being a vegetarian, and then the cookbook kind of came kind of as a natural result of just making stuff that didn't exist, because that was just part of kind of our crew to do stuff like that, I guess.
Yeah. And that's, I guess, kind of ties into why you felt like food was an important thing to write a zine about, right? Or
yeah, I mean, it was. It became very clear to us early on that eating and what you put in your mouth and what you decide to pay for or not pay for in terms of food was a big part of our politics. And I think I won't say we, because I can't say particularly the trajectory for Joel, but I think this definitely crosses over. The kinds of reasons that were important definitely changed over time, with sort of different slants on. I mean, they were always more political and ethical than they were health related, although certainly the health benefit and health was a part of it, but that was never the primary motivation, was not to be healthier. And in fact, when we first were vegetarian and vegan, we were definitely not healthy. I mean, not probably as bad as a lot of people, but we weren't as, sort of planful. It's just like, oh, awesome, bean burritos 7 times a week or whatever, great, or whatever.
Right.
Because it was vegan, that's great.
Yeah.
So I think it took a little growing up with some of that stuff to go, oh, maybe we should balance this a little bit better or whatever. But it was definitely like the focus initially for both of us really was on animals and animal rights, and our perspective really was about animals. And then that sort of became expanded in thinking about the environment, and then thinking about sort of ecosystemic types of perspectives. And I mean, it all kind of works together, but the general sort of broader philosophy shifted.
Okay.
In terms of like why, et cetera, but yeah.
Like in terms of why you were making the zine, or also why you were vegetarian
or vegan? Why food was important, and why was it important to talk about, if that makes sense. So I think it was still important and still important to talk about, but I think, in the beginning, it was very much focused on the rights of animals, and then that started to shift. Not that the rights weren't important, but then thinking about things, sort of from an environmental perspective or your impact on the earth and those kind of things. I think it just became more complex as why does food matter in terms of the kinds of stuff that we're doing? Because you could do a zine about anything, and obviously there are zines about everything. So it is sort of interesting to think about, well, we had a punk rock music zine. Why did we do food? You could have done, a million. I mean, as I'm sure you're aware, there's just zines for like every single possible that you can think of. I think I'm going to add another reason why.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that would be reason, I think I covered reason one. So another reason was that for us, definitely cooking was a community activity. And being vegan at the time had a lot to do with connecting us to each other, spending time together, connecting to other people, so I think it definitely served. I think that was one of the reasons that it was so important. So it wasn't just an important sort of political or ethical or moral kind of issue, but it definitely was a part of us being together and living together and doing things together and doing things as a small community. And it was always like fun for us, like entertaining people or bands that came by, or particularly when they were not vegetarian or vegan, then it was just like a challenge, like, we are going to show you the vegetarian food's awesome.
Right.
And, there's some famous story about Mike from NoFX, like, totally complaining about, oh, you guys are going to make terrible vegetarian food or whatever, and apparently he's vegetarian now, which is kind of funny. But, so there was that element of community, and I think just food as a way of showing care towards each other was definitely expressed in our house, and I think that was a big part of it too. And putting together the book in a way that was also very community-minded reflected that.
Okay. And so that kind of actually brings me just some of my next couple of questions. So what years were you working on the zine, and do you know when it was completed? I know that's a tough one.
It's close to 25 years ago, so it was probably 23 years ago. So, it'd be like 88, 89 maybe?
Okay.
Yeah, it was definitely like around then. And it is it's really funny because, part of it I think was being teenagers and being sort of self-absorbed as many teenagers are. I mean, it never occurred to us to put a date on it. Or, and even the same thing with like flyers and stuff like that. We never put dates on anything because you're just kind of living in the moment, so you don't think about anyone's going to care about it later.
The flyer thing especially, I think about that because like nobody puts the year on those things, like hardly ever.
Because you can kind of figure out when, but depending on what bands are on the flyer.
Right, like who the openers are.
If this band and this band played together, it had to be between X and Y or whatever, but sometimes you can't really tell that either.
And then it's always funny, like right before I moved to Boston, this one house in Pittsburgh, like somebody had gotten together like a informal like flyer show and just like put it up all over the show space there, and it was just like funny because I could pick out certain ones, and then other things I'm like, I have no idea when that happened, like
right. And I'm actually really bad with remembering those kind of details anyway, so like friends of mine are really, like, actually, if you talked to Eric yet?
We've been emailing.
Okay, because you should. He's really good for like crazy details. So I mean, he's definitely someone you should talk with on the phone, or whatever, Skype, because he'll remember stuff much better. I'm much better at like bigger picture, broader, whatever. But he'll be like, oh, well, it was that one show, and he'll remember like the bands that played, and we were there, and we had Soy Not Oi, and like he'll tell me, he's like, remember that time that skinhead was giving you a hard time? But I'm like, no,